He called my name from the front porch in that slow, thoughtful way he always had. But what he showed me when I stepped outside that night wasn't anything I'd prepared myself for. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't dangerous. It was the kind of quiet moment that reaches down and changes the way you see a person you thought you already knew, and just as quietly, changes how you see yourself. By the time I went back inside, I knew this was going to be one of those memories that would follow me for the rest of my life. Before I start, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Are you in a small town where the evenings fall slow and gentle, or in a city where the lights never quite go dark? Wherever you are, I'm willing to bet there's a place nearby. A backyard, a field, a corner of a park that holds memories the way the one I'm about to tell you about holds mine. My name is Sandra, and I was 19 when this happened. Old enough to think I understood who my father was. Young enough that the world still felt too big for my hands. That evening, the air outside smelled like warm dust and pine. Late summer had its own kind of twilight in our town, where the day and night lingered together for a few extra minutes, reluctant to let go. I was sitting cross-legged on my bedroom floor, a pile of old notebooks scattered around me, when I heard his voice drift down the hallway. "Sandra, come out here a minute." But it wasn't urgent. But it wasn't casual either. My dad, Matthew, had this particular tone when something sat on his heart. Not heavy enough to break him, but heavy enough to slow him down. I paused, waiting to see if he'd call again. The house stayed still, just the low hum of the fridge and leaves brushing against the siding outside my window. When I stepped out onto the porch, I saw him in the driveway, hands buried awkwardly in the pockets of his old jacket. The sky behind him was painted in fading orange and purple. Fireflies blinked weakly around the edges of the yard, hovering over the tall grass like tiny, confused stars. He turned at the sound of the door, and for the first time in a long time, I saw something like shyness flicker across his features. My dad wasn't a shy man. He was the steady kind, the one who showed up, who meant what he said, who measured his words and stuck by them, maybe a little stubborn, but in the kind of way that always felt like safety. "You okay?" I asked, stepping carefully down the wooden steps. He nodded, cleared his throat. "I want to show you something." Just that. 6 simple words, but my stomach did a little twist, not in fear, more in recognition that this wasn't about a broken shovel from the shed or a bill he wanted to go over with me. This was more. He motioned toward the back of the property, beyond the gravel drive, into where the trees crowded closer together. Our boots crunched over the dry patches and sank just a little into the softer earth. The crickets out there didn't bother with subtlety. They filled the air with a steady chorus, wrapping around us as we walked. The path itself was one I knew. I'd walked it plenty of times as a kid, stomping through mud, chasing imaginary adventures, crying over little heartbreaks that felt enormous back then. But the way he walked it that night, with quiet intention and the occasional glance back to make sure I was still with him, that part was new. We didn't speak much. Every so often, he'd flick his eyes toward me, as if to say, "You still good?" Without using the words, I'd nod back. There was a tug inside my chest, half concern, half curiosity. We reached a small opening where the trees thinned and the sky peeked through. The clearing. When I was younger, this had been my head out, my thinking spot, the place I ran to when homework and friendships and future plans pressed in too hard. I hadn't been there in years. Seeing it again, bathed in soft moonlight, made something soft in me stir, like bumping into an old friend and realizing how much you'd missed them. Dad stopped near the center and turned to face me. He took a slow breath, the kind he took when he was steadying himself, not for my sake, but for his own. Then he slid his right hand into his jacket pocket. For a second, my mind pictured all sorts of dramatic possibilities. An old letter, a photograph I'd never seen, some hidden document about our family. What he pulled out was small, ordinary looking, wrapped tightly in a faded square of cloth. "Before I show you this," he said, "I need you to hear me out." His voice wasn't heavy, but there was something fragile in it, a thin edge that told me this mattered to him, maybe more than anything he'd shared with me before. He met my eyes. In that dim light, Years I'd never lived with him were visible in the lines around his mouth and the tired kindness in his gaze. For a moment I felt very young and very old, all at once. "Okay," I said quietly. "I'm listening." We sat down on the cool grass. The earth was soft beneath my palms, smelling of soil and leaves and something ancient. Fireflies glided lazily between the branches. The world felt paused, like everything beyond the ring of trees had taken one step back to give this moment some space. "When I was about your age," Dad began, "I used to come out here nearly every night." He glanced around the clearing, almost like he was seeing other ghosts sitting where we were, versions of himself, of his father before him. "This spot meant something to me," he continued. "Long before there was you, I used to think, one day, I'll bring my kid here. I'll tell them about how it felt to be 19, not having a clue but having all this." He spread his arm to indicate the trees, the sky. "Around me anyway. Then life happened. I blinked, and that kid was nearly grown, sorting through notebooks in her room." I smiled despite the weight of his words. He'd just perfectly described what I'd been doing when he called me outside. He started unfolding the cloth. Inside was an old pocket watch, brass, dull in some places, gleaming in others. The metal's edges were smooth from years of thumbprints. Time had left its own fingerprints in the tiny scratches and tarnish. "This was your grandfather's?" Dad said. "And his father's before that." I sucked in a breath. I'd heard about my grandfather, of course, bits and pieces. Stories at holidays. Little flashes of who he'd been, the way he laughed, the way he whistled while fixing things. But I'd never held anything that had been his. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cool metal. "I didn't know you had this," I whispered. "Kept it tucked away for a long time," he admitted. "Wasn't sure when, or even if, I was supposed to pass it on." He said it like this watch wasn't just an object, but a kind of question he'd been carrying. "Go ahead." He nodded. "Open it." I found the tiny latch and pressed. It popped open with a soft click. On one side, delicate hands ticked over a cream-colored face, still keeping stubborn time. On the other, tucked behind a thin cover, was a small photograph. A young man stood in the very same clearing, hands in his pockets, grin wide and effortless. The edges of the photo had yellowed, but his expression was full of a kind of ease I recognized. "Grandpa?" I asked. Yad said. He was 21 there. Said this place reminded him that for all the ways life got complicated, some things stayed simple. Trees grow, stars come out, watches tick. I stared at the photograph, then at the clearing around us. It was as if time had folded in on itself, letting 3 generations sit in the same circle for a moment. "Why now?" I asked softly. "Why show me this tonight?" He let out a breath he'd apparently been holding for years. "Because I realized I don't want to wait anymore," he said. "I've spent too long telling myself, I'll tell her that later. I'll show her that another time. But later sneaks up on you. Suddenly you're looking at your daughter and she's more woman than girl. And you realize, if I don't share this now, when?" There was something achingly tender in his voice. "And," he added, "I want you to know, really know, that you're part of something. Not just our little house in our quiet street, something longer, something that started before either of us and will keep going after." He paused, then smiled a little. "And because there's more." "More," I echoed. "There's something I've never told anyone else about this thing," he said, nodding at the watch. "But if you're ready to hear it, I'd like you to be the first." I looked at the watch ticking gently between my fingers, then at my father, silhouetted in moonlight, and nodded. "I'm ready." We fell into a softer stillness before he continued, the kind of quiet that feels like the last deep breath before you jump into cold water. "This watch," he said, "has been at a lot of crossroads." He tilted his head back, eyes following some memory into the night sky. "When your grandfather was young, he made a lot of impulsive decisions," Dad said. "Some he was proud of, some kept him up at night. Whenever things went sideways, he'd pull this out, listen to it tick, and remind himself that time was still moving forward, whether he got his act together or not." Dad's mouth twitched in a faint smile. When he gave it to me, he went on, I was about your age. I'd just gotten into trouble I didn't think I'd dig my way out of. I'd hurt someone I cared about. Thought I'd ruin things for good. I turned toward him, surprised. Dad rarely talked about his life before fatherhood except in vague generalities. He brought me out here, Dad said, gesturing to the grass. Right here. Put this watch in my hand. And he told me, you can't rewind, son. This doesn't go backward. But every click you feel is a chance to decide differently than you did yesterday. My throat tightened. I didn't think you'd messed up like that, I said quietly. He chuckled under his breath. Oh, I've messed up plenty, he said. Difference is, I had people who let me grow from it instead of nailing me to it for life. His eyes found mine again, and there was a gentleness there that wrapped around me like a blanket. I want you to know, he said, that you'll make choices you're proud of, and choices you're not. You'll have days you feel like you're doing everything right, and days you can't stand the person in the mirror, but I need you to remember one thing. He took the watch back just long enough to close his fingers around it, then laid it gently in my palm. Who you are isn't frozen in your worst or best moment, he said quietly. You're more than any single choice. That's why this keeps ticking. To remind us we get more than one. Tears pricked my eyes, not because his words were sad, but because they were truer than anything I'd let myself think about my own life. I'd been so afraid of making the wrong move, choosing the wrong major, trusting the wrong person, taking the wrong job, that I'd stopped moving at all. You know what else? He added, voice softer. I've spent a lot of years trying to be the kind of dad who never lets his kids see him struggle, the kind who's always ready with an answer. But that's not real. I've been scared. I've doubted myself. I've stayed up at night wondering if I'd messed you up somehow. I looked at him, genuinely stunned. It never occurred to me that he feared me seeing him as anything less than enough. Dad, I said, my voice catching, You've done more for me than I could ever write down. He smiled, a little crooked. I know you think that now, he said, but in a few years you might look back and realize I've made some wrong calls. When you do, I want you to come talk to me about them. Not run away, not carry them alone, just talk. We sat in silence for a few breaths, crickets sang. Fireflies blinked, the watch ticked. My heart settled into the rhythm of all three. Thank you, I whispered eventually, for trusting me with this. With all of this. He nodded, then looked almost shy again. Think you can forgive me for taking 19 years to get around to it? I laughed softly, wiping at my eyes. Yeah, I said. I think I can manage that. We stayed in the clearing a while longer, trading a few more stories. He told me about the time my grandfather almost sold the watch to pay rent and decided against it at the pawn shop door. I told him about the things that had been scaring me lately. What I wanted to study, where to live, whether I was enough of anything to become someone. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't pretend to. But he listened. He shared his own doubts, not as a lecture, but as a conversation. When the sky had deepened into a dark, velvet blue speckled with stars, he finally pushed himself to his feet and held out a hand, ready to head back. I looked at the watch resting in my palm one more time, then placed it gently around my neck, letting it rest against my chest. Yeah, I said. I'm ready. And the walk back to the house was quieter than the walk out had been, but the quiet had changed. It wasn't filled with questions this time. It was full of understanding. On the porch, before we went inside, he touched my shoulder lightly. Hey, he said. Whenever you feel lost, or like you've screwed something up too badly to come talk to me, remember this night, okay? I will, I said, and I meant it. Inside the house looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. Same couch, same stack of mail, same faint ring on the coffee table where someone had put down a sweating glass without a coaster. But it didn't feel the same. I didn't feel the same. Later, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the soft, steady tick resting against my collarbone. I realized that what my dad had given me wasn't just a family heirloom. It was a kind of compass. A reminder that time doesn't freeze when I make a mistake. That the people who came before me wrestled with the same fear of failure and kept going anyway. That my father, this quiet, steady man, had whole chapters of his life I'd never known, and that he chose, finally, to open one of them and let me read it with him. In the days that followed, things didn't magically become perfect. I still argued with him about curfews. We still disagreed about the music I blasted from my room. He still groaned at my driving. But underneath all of that, something new had settled, a deeper respect, a quieter trust, a shared knowledge that we were more than just parent and child. We were two people in different chapters of our stories, connected by more than just DNA. Now, when I think about that night, about the clearing and the watch and his voice under the trees, I realize something. Sometimes the biggest shifts in your life don't happen in front of a crowd. They happen on ordinary evenings, after someone calls your name from the porch. They happen in simple places, backyards, kitchens, small clearings tucked behind a fence. They happen when someone you love decides to share the piece of themselves they've kept quiet for too long. And sometimes, the most valuable inheritance you receive isn't money or property. It's a story, a moment, a lesson about time and choice, and the fact that you're allowed to grow beyond who you were yesterday. If you're listening to this and thinking of someone in your own life, someone whose voice has always felt like home, maybe this is your sign to ask them about their story. You might be surprised by what they're ready to share. And by what you discover about yourself in the quiet, in between spaces where listening becomes its own kind of love.